Welcome everybody who's joining us a little bit early. We'll start in a few seconds. So good evening, everybody. Good evening from Apara Art Foundation, Ganesh Shivaswamy Foundation, and our esteemed speaker, Mr. Schoenberg. So the Apara Foundation for the Arts, together with Ganesh Shivaswamy Foundation, is delighted to present The Art and Law, a new lecture series exploring the long and often complex relationship between artistic creation and law. At first, art and law can seem to belong to two very different worlds. Art emerges from imagination, expression, and a creative impulse. And law is built upon structure, precedent, interpretation, and an extraordinary body of knowledge. And yet, inevitably, they continually find themselves entwined. The moment a work of art moves beyond the artist and into the world, it enters a complex web of ownership, authenticity, inheritance, protection, censorship, and movement across borders, and at times the fundamental question of to whom it truly belongs to. These are not entirely modern questions. Art and law have intersected for centuries, shaping the lives of artists, the histories of collections, and the institutions which art is preserved through and understood. In most times, restitution, intellectual property, museum collections, and artists' rights have made this relationship even more visible. Through this series, we hope to look beyond the artwork itself and examine the legal, historical, and ethical structures that surround it, and to explore what happens when something as deeply human and creative as art encounters the complexities of law. To open this initiative, we are deeply honored to share the reflections of Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya, former Chief Justice of India, on the relationship between art, law, beauty, and artistic expression. May I now invite you to watch this very, very short film featuring Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya, former Chief Justice of India, as he reflects on the relationship between art and law.
Law and art have rarely been comfortable neighbors. One speaks in rules, precedents, and prohibition, the other in metaphor, excess, and ambiguity. Art looks at beauty as if it concerns it. Law looks at it as a potential moral violator. Yearning for a higher life based on the moral absolutes of truth, beauty, and goodness has always been the great human ambition. Yet, what is beauty, what is truth, what is goodness have defied definition. As Robert Browning wrote in The Guardian Angel, he said, "O world, as God has made it, all is beauty, and knowing this is love, and love is duty." Whenever the liberal arts and law have been made to share a courtroom, the encounter is almost always narrated as a contest. In the popular imagination, it is always art versus law, but perhaps the framing of art versus law misunderstands what art is for. Because Kazantzakis, who documented the life of Saint Francis of Assisi in God's Pauper, said that art has this right, and not only the right, but the duty to subject everything to the essence. It feeds upon this story and assimilates it slowly, cunningly, and turns it into a legend. Few verses have answered that question as completely as Raja Ravi Verma. From 1894, his prints have given India's goddesses and apsaras bodies they had rarely possessed outside the temple stone. He was present at the trial before the Bombay High Court concerning allegations of obscenity and bore direct witness to the trials of artistic expression. Yet he kept painting, and what he painted became the default face of the Indian divine, framed in calendars and puja rooms for over a century. Verma's pictures were made luminous, familiar, unforgettable. The particular dissolved into the essence exactly as Kazantzakis described. Perhaps the contest was never art versus law. It is art quietly redeeming the question before the law has finished, asking it, and the touch of Raja Ravi Verma is the definition and of redemption. Ganesh Shivaswamy and Sharan Apparao have embarked upon exploring the intersection of art and law. Both these voices bear the burden of society and together carry a civilizational message. An interdisciplinary approach to learning is the need of the hour. It gives me great pleasure to announce this initiative, and I bless the endeavor every success.
It is now my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, Randol Schoenberg. Mr. Schoenberg is an award-winning American lawyer and was co-founding partner of Burris and Schoenberg LLP, where he handled complex business litigations and specialized in cases involving looted art and the recovery of property stolen by the Nazi authorities during the Holocaust. Among his most prominent cases is the landmark Republic of Austria versus Altmann, which resulted in the successful return of 5 paintings by Gustav Klimt to their rightful owner, Maria Altmann. The extraordinary story was the case later inspired in the 2015 film Woman in Gold, starring Helen Mirren with Ryan Reynolds portraying Mr. Schoenberg. Mr. Schoenberg graduated from Princeton University with a Bachelor's of Arts in Mathematics and a certificate in European Cultural Studies, and received his Juris Doctor degree from the University of Southern California. His many honors include the California Law Attorney of the Year Award for his outstanding achievement in litigation, the Jurisprudence Award from the Anti-Defamation League, and the Justice Louis D. Brandeis Award from the American Jewish Congress. His engagement with history and remembrance extends well beyond the courtroom. From 2005 to 2015, he served as the president of the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, during which time the museum constructed its new building in Pan Pacific Park. He also led the redesign of its permanent exhibition and served as the acting executive director in 2013. He is also an expert genealogical researcher and author with a particularly focus on Austrian and Czech Jewish genealogy. His most recent project is the award-winning documentary Fioretta, released in 2023, in which he and his son undertake a journey through 500 years of family history leading back to the founding of the Jewish ghetto in Venice. It is particularly fitting that we begin our Law and Art series with someone whose work has brought together law, art, history, and questions of memory and justice in such a remarkable way. Mr. Schoenberg, we're truly, truly grateful and honored to have you with us this evening, and we very much look forward to hearing from you. Now, I request Ganesh to tell us what the talk is going to be about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharan, and welcome everybody to the first Art and Law lecture of the Appara Foundation for the Arts and the Ganesh Shivaswamy Foundation. In recent times, India has witnessed the return of many cultural and religious objects which have been taken away through acts of misappropriation like theft and vandalism. In order to remedy such a wrong, the effort which is required to rectify is always a hard one. It requires indefatigable assiduity and a lot of consistency. One such example is the talk which Mr. Schoenberg will give us this evening. During World War II, the Nazis, as they went about targeting the Jewish community, took away many things, including many paintings of Gustav Klimt from the Bloch-Bauer family in Vienna, one of which was particularly the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. This painting finally was displayed at the Belvedere Museum in Vienna and was also called at some point in time the Mona Lisa of Austria. Much later, Adele's niece, Maria Altman, commenced proceedings in America to have the painting returned. Representing her in this litigation, which went across two continents, Europe and America, is our speaker for the evening, Mr. Randol Schoenberg. This litigation or this contest, which went across Europe and America, brings about many questions, many interesting questions, which we hope to explore. One of which is to correct a wrong through reparation and repatriation. The conflicting point of view is that of territoriality, of culture. As Sharon already mentioned, this litigation went on to be dramatized in the 2015 movie Woman in Gold, which starred Dame Helen Mirren as Mrs. Altman and Ryan Reynolds as our speaker for the evening, Mr. Schoenberg. I'm truly honored on behalf of both of our foundations to have Mr. Schoenberg deliver the first art and law lecture. Ladies and gentlemen who are following us on the live stream, please put up your comments and your questions on the comment section. We will take these comments at the end of the talk. And on that note, Mr. Schoenberg, thank you so much for being with us. And that on that note of gratitude, I hand over the platform to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Ganesh and Sharon, for a wonderful introduction. And good morning or good evening from the other end of the world. I'm here in Los Angeles, and it's really incredible to be speaking to people in India. It's my first time doing a lecture to an Indian audience. So really, thank you so much for this invitation. So let me start by trying to put the slides up, which is always a question if it works. Let's see. There we go. There it is. I think that's working, right? There we go. Okay, so here's the story of the recovery of the Klimt paintings from Austria, which I'm going to tell. And if you've seen the Woman in Gold movie, you know one aspect of the story. I'm going to focus maybe a little bit more on the legal aspects today and some of the historical aspects, but they did a pretty good job with the movie. So if you've seen it, you know the basics. So here is my former client, Maria Altman. She was a very good friend of my family, of my grandparents, my mother's parents, Eric and Truda Seisel. Maria's husband, Fritz, had wanted to be an opera singer, and my mother's father, Eric Seisel, was a composer in Austria, and they'd known each other already in the 20s and 30s in Vienna. Both families then fled the Nazis in 1938. And came ultimately to the United States and then to Los Angeles around the same time in 1941 when the war started with the United States and Japan and Germany. And there they reconnected. They both had children at the same time in 1940. And so my mother, who was an only child, grew up really with the Altman kids. Maria had 4 children as her sort of surrogate siblings. And the families took vacations together, and they were just always present. So it was the type of relationship where almost like an aunt who isn't related. That's how close we were with Maria. And this black and white picture is one that I found in my grandmother's things. Now, Maria was a little bit younger than her husband Fritz and my grandparents. And so by the time the story started, she was the last one left and was the one who was able to take this journey with me. So let me get started and tell you her story. First, a little bit of history to give you some background on Austria-Hungary and the Jews of Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary was a large Central European empire. I think today there are 12 or 13 countries that made up that empire. It extended all the way into Ukraine and down into Italy and most of Yugoslavia. And it was and also parts of Poland, etc. So it was an enormous empire. But what you need to know is that the capital city, Vienna, had expelled all Jews in 1670, and only let them come back in very small numbers through about 1848. So at that time, there were only a few thousand Jews living in the capital city of Vienna, which was, of course, the economic center of the empire. Jews received full civil rights in Austria-Hungary only in 1867, which, when I'm talking to American audiences, I put in perspective, that's 2 years after the U.S. Civil War, where African Americans were given rights in the United States. So it's around that same time that Jews get full civil rights. They're able to go into all the professions, they're able to move around, and they're able to buy property. And so this time period coincided with the Industrial Revolution in Austria that involved a lot of economic activity. If you ever go to Vienna, or if you've been to Vienna, they had a large city wall, and that was taken down around this time in the 1860s, and they built up these enormous buildings that we see today in Vienna that make up what is so wonderful about Vienna. These were all built in that 1860s, 1870s time frame. And so with all that economic activity, there was a flood of people who came into the city from all over the empire, not just Jews, but a large number of Jews came in. So the population grew from 1848, about 2,000 Jews, to 1900, there were about 200,000 Jews, about 10% of the population. So some of these families did very well, some did not. My family, for example, much of it came to Vienna during that time, and they did not become wealthy. They were very poor. But a few of the families sort of hit it rich, and these included the Blochs and the Bauers. The Blochs were a family from Bohemia, and they developed a process for sugar production from sugar beets, and basically monopolized sugar production in Austria-Hungary. So they became enormously wealthy through that. Gustav, Maria's father, was the president of the sugar company. Gustav is her father was the lawyer for the sugar company. His brother Ferdinand was the president. The Bauers, I should say, were involved in banking, and railroads, which were being built at that time, also became very, very wealthy. So what happened was two brothers married two sisters. So you have Gustav and Teresa Bloch-Bauer, Maria's parents, and the younger siblings, Ferdinand and Adele Bloch-Bauer. So Ferdinand and Gustav were brothers, Adele and Teresa were sisters, and they, maybe to make their names a little more fancy, they combined them, and it became Bloch-Bauer instead of just Bloch. And so these were the Bloch-Bauers. Now, Maria's family, her parents had 5 children. Maria was the last, what we might call an accident baby. She was 8 years younger than the number 4, her sister Louisa, and had 3 even older brothers, which is why at the end of the story, she's the only one left. Her uncle and aunt, unfortunately, did not succeed in having children. I think there were many pregnancies that failed that Adele had. And I always thought that perhaps to compensate for that, they collected a lot of artwork. And so let me show you some of their collection. First of all, this is the home that they had. It's called a Palais. If you go to Vienna and you know where the famous Vienna State Opera is, this is sort of 1 block outside of the ring and 1 block over from the opera. So it's a very, very wonderful neighborhood, and they owned this whole building. Ferdinand ran the sugar company from there, and on 1 floor they had their home as well. And in their home, they, as I mentioned, they had dozens and dozens of paintings and artworks, mostly from Viennese and Austrian masters in the Biedermeier style, it's called. People you might not have heard of, like Ferdinand Waldmüller, but they would have 12 paintings by him and things like that. They had a Rodin sculpture. They had the largest collection of antique Austrian porcelain in the world, over 300 settings. So each of these cup and saucer is 1 setting. So imagine having 300 of these gorgeous things in their home. There was already a book made of it in the 1920s. They had, of course, if you're very rich, you have a nice little summer cottage. This is their summer home. It looks enormous in Bohemia, near where the Blochs were from. As just one of the many interesting side notes to this story, this home in Bohemia was taken by the Nazis after they invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939, and was used as the residence for what they called the Reichsprotector of Bohemian Moravia, which was the top Nazi official in all of Czechoslovakia, or at least in the Czech part. And first it was a man named Konstantin von Neurath, and then he was moved around and replaced by Reinhard Heydrich. So Reinhard Heydrich is, I always say, if in case you don't know who he is, he's on everybody's top 5 Nazi list, right? He's one of the really top big bad Nazis. He is the one who organized the famous or infamous Wannsee Conference in Berlin, where they plotted the extermination of all the Jews in Europe. He returned back home to this home, the former Bloch-Bauer home in Czechoslovakia, and was driving into Prague when he was assassinated by Czech partisans. He was killed by them, and as a result, the Nazis went, and they thought that there was a certain town in Bohemia that had been helping the partisans, and they went and wiped out everybody in the town. They killed all the men and boys and sent the women and young children off to concentration camps. It's a famous episode early on in the Nazi period, and so famous that they made 2 Hollywood movies about it, one of which ended up being scored. The music was made by my mother's father, Eric Seisel. It's called Hitler's Madmen. So anyway, that's just a side story to this already very, very interesting and incredible story. Now, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, in 1900, the most famous, the best, the most expensive artist in Vienna was Gustav Klimt. He had started out as a sort of academic painter, getting lots of commissions in these new public buildings, doing giant murals and ceiling paintings and things like that. He was really just the finest draftsman of his time. He then, in around 1900, formed something called the Secession, where he and some friends seceded from the academy and started doing more impressionist and modern artwork. He got tired of his friends at the Secession and went out on his own and just became an independent painter working on commissions. And some of his, actually a large portion of the commissions he received were from these sort of nouveau riche, recently wealthy Jewish patrons like the Bloch-Bauers. There was another family, the Lederer family and the Turcokondo family, and between those 3 families, they commissioned 30 of his large-scale paintings out of, I think, a total of 200 that he did before he died in the flu epidemic in 1918. So that's Gustav Klimt. Now, Ferdinand, who's sort of newly married, hired Klimt then to do a portrait of his young wife, Adele, and for a number of years, Klimt made studies. There are hundreds of these drawings of Adele that Klimt made before he finally finished in 1907 his masterpiece, the gold portrait, the woman in gold portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer #1. And you can see that it has, since we have an art crowd, I can talk a little bit about the art history of it. Apparently, Klimt had taken a visit to Ravenna, Italy, where they had old Roman mosaics, and inspired by that, he came up with this sort of gold leaf style with all sorts of little artifacts in it. So she's sort of buried behind this gold mosaic. Interestingly, Adele was the only person who had 2 full-length portraits done by Gustav Klimt. This is the second one, done in 1912. It's much more reserved, and you can see these maybe Japanese or Chinese figurines in the background, which was then the influence on Klimt at that time. Now, when the first portrait came out, there were some rumors because Klimt had something of a reputation in Vienna. As a matter of fact, when he died in 1918, there were, I think, 18 illegitimate children who claimed that Klimt was the father. He liked to paint, in this long smock with nothing underneath, and liked to fool around with his models. And so there were rumors at the time that Adele and Klimt might have had an affair. Maria said she asked her mother at one point if this was true, and her mother said absolutely not. And then Maria smiled and said, well, she would have said that even if it had been true. So she wasn't so sure whether it was true or not. But the art historians say that whatever heat was on between Klimt and Adele in 1907 was clearly not there anymore in 1912. It's a much more reserved painting where she's sort of standing aside from him. So anyway, those were the two portraits. The Bloch-Bauers, Ferdinand purchased a number of other paintings by Klimt. This birch forest or beechwood paintings are given titles usually by dealers and art historians and not the artists themselves. So depending on which tree you look at, it's given a different name, but we'll call it birch forest here. They have this beautiful apple tree, the first of several that Klimt did. This may have been painted while Klimt was a guest of the Bloch-Bauers at their estate in Bohemia, in the vacation home. This is people say because in the right corner it looks slightly unfinished. It may have been bought from his estate in 1918. The house is in Untrach, Attersee, completed around 1916. And then the third of four beautiful pictures that Klimt did of this castle on Lake Kammer, Kammer am Attersee, in 1917, really beautiful picture. So they have the two portraits and four landscapes. And unfortunately, Adele developed meningitis in 1925 and died very tragically. She was only, I think, 42 years old, relatively young. And she had written a handwritten will, just 4 pages. These are two of them, just a couple of years before, after her parents had died. And she was probably helped by Maria's father, who was the lawyer for the family. He's named as a sort of executor of her will. And it's a very, very brief will. And on the right side of the page, you see here in this section, she makes various bequests to charitable organizations. Adele was, by all accounts, a very brilliant woman. Maria always said in a different time she would have gone to university and become a doctor or a lawyer, professor, even a politician. She was that type of person, and she always had a salon of very intellectual people surrounding her. And she was also very civic-minded and social-minded, and a supporter of Austria's new socialist government after World War I in 1918. And so she made, in her will, written at this time, a number of bequests to various social organizations in Vienna. And in the bottom paragraph on the right, it says, "My two portraits and the four landscapes of Gustav Klimt, bitte ich meine Ehegatten," means I ask please that my husband, after his death, give these to the Austrian State Gallery in Vienna. And in the same sentence, she says her library in the castle that they had in Bohemia should be given to the Vienna Workers and Peoples and Workers Library. Okay, so again, she says, my husband, after your death, please give the Klimt paintings to the Austrian Gallery and my library to the Vienna Peoples and Workers Library. So this is where things stood in 1925. In 1926, Maria's father, the lawyer for the family, presented this to the court and made some comments which are of interest. So he said that it should be noted, he said, that the deceased, Adele, made certain requests in her will which do not have the binding character of a testament. But, he said, her husband promises to fulfill her wishes, and he says it should be noted that the Klimt paintings were not her property, but his property. So what does this all mean? So when you write a will, unfortunately, when it needs to be read and interpreted, you're no longer alive to help, right? So lawyers have rules of interpretation for wills. And there's a difference between what they call precatory language, which are requests that you might make in your will, from binding requirements. So the example I like to give is, let's say we have a dog. We don't, but let's say we have, my wife and I have a dog, and I die, and I write in my will, please, my dear wife, take care of the dog when I'm gone. And my wife says, I never liked that dog, get him out of here. That's probably okay. I just said, please take care of the dog. It's not a requirement that she do that. If, on the other hand, I had said, as a condition of receiving $1 from my estate, you must agree to take care of our dog in the manner to which it's become accustomed until its dying day, right? So very specific language. Then it's a requirement, right? And so the courts have to decide what is just a request and what's a requirement. And interestingly, even when there was no dispute after Adele died, the family considered this just a request, and that's how it was presented. The second issue is he said, well, her husband promises, so you might ask, well, does Ferdinand's promise, is that enforceable? He promised to give these when he died. And then lastly, the paintings belong to him and not her. Well, back in the 1920s, of course, this is a much more sexist and patriarchal legal system at that time. So women could have property. Adele actually had quite a lot of property she owned half the home, for example, that they lived in Vienna because she had inherited from her father a lot of money. But for whatever reason, the Klimt paintings were considered his property and not hers, so no communal property in Austria at that time. And the rule was that if there was a dispute, it was presumed to be the husband's property anyway. So the bottom line is that Adele made requests that her husband do something with his property when he died. And he, in 1925-26, certainly intended to do that. As a matter of fact, here's the Austrian gallery, the Belvedere Museum, which you can visit today. This was one of the Habsburg emperor's summer homes that was built in Vienna and ultimately used to house Austrian art after World War I, when the Habsburgs fell and there was a new socialist government. And so Ferdinand became the president of the Friends of the Art Museum and was very involved with it. And in 1936, he actually donated this landscape, Schlosskammer am Attersee number 3, to the museum. So he was not yet dead, but he was donating one of the 6 paintings mentioned in Adele's will. Just to make things a little confusing, he also purchased another Klimt painting, this one of his friend Amalia Zuckerkandel, also a bit unfinished. And this woman actually was murdered by the Nazis later, along with her daughter. She was sent to an extermination camp and killed. So this is a portrait of a victim of the Nazis. So he had the 5 of the 6 mentioned in Adele's will, plus this other one, making 6, when in 1938, the Nazis invaded. Now, shortly before that, in December 37, Maria married her husband, Fritz. Maria was just 21 years old at the time. She went on her honeymoon to Italy, to the Alps, and returned back home. She turned 22 in February 1938, and in March 1938 was the infamous Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany. So from one day to the next, Maria went from the top of the world to the very bottom, as the lives of Jews were changed irreparably by the Anschluss. All their rights were basically taken away, and the Nazis began their project of expropriation and extermination. Now, Maria's husband, Fritz, was the younger brother of a very wealthy sweater manufacturer named Bernhard Altmann, he had a textile company in Vienna with a big factory. And he was an early target of the Nazis, he knew, so he fled in advance of the Anschluss outside of Austria, and he was sort of a business genius, is how I like to describe him. There's some people, you could put them on a deserted island on Friday, and by Monday they would be a millionaire. That's Bernhard Altmann, that's Fritz's older brother. So he went and left Austria and sent telegrams to all of his clients saying, don't send any money to Vienna, I'm going to come and pick up the money that's due our firm. So he went to Budapest and Rome and London and picked up the receivables, and then he went to the British and said, hey, I'd like to start a new company in Liverpool. And the British said, come right in. And he started up a brand new company in Liverpool. Maria and Fritz, as a result, were put under watch by the Gestapo, and ultimately Fritz was arrested and sent to Dachau, the first German concentration camp outside of Munich, where he spent several months until Bernhard, his brother, was able to raise enough money to basically bribe and ransom his brother out of Dachau, which is a very rare thing. And so he made a deal to send money back into Germany and got Fritz out of prison. They were still under house arrest, and if you saw the film, part was very accurate. They engineered sort of a doctor's appointment and escaped out the back, and were flown then in a plane to Cologne, Germany, and then they made their way north to Holland, trying to cross the border. At that time, the Dutch were sending Jewish refugees back. They were patrolling the border, and so they had to try to sneak across. They found a Catholic priest, I think, who helped them sneak across. That priest was later captured by the Nazis and executed, I think, a few weeks later. It was a very dangerous journey, but they made it into Holland, where Bernard Altman met them and brought them to safety in England. He then sent them on to the United States, to Fall River, Massachusetts, where Bernard was starting up yet another company with another factory. And they lived in Fall River, Massachusetts for a couple of years until the war started with the United States in 1941, and that's when they moved to California. And as I mentioned before, reunited with my grandparents, who had a similar dangerous journey out of Austria. So what happened to Ferdinand and his artworks? Ferdinand was, like Bernard Altman, very prominent, very wealthy, and he managed to escape right at the beginning in March. He first went to Czechoslovakia, but then the Nazis came in and took Czechoslovakia just a year later, and so he escaped again to Zurich, Switzerland, where he was by some friends in a hotel and really lived throughout the entire war until the end of 1945 in Zurich, Switzerland, when he died of old age, never having returned to Austria or recovered any of his property, never being reunited with any of his family again. And so what happened to all of his property and possessions? Well, back in Vienna in 1938-39, a Dr. Führer, a lawyer, was appointed to help liquidate all of Ferdinand's property, and they imposed various taxes against him using different legal procedures, and so all of his property was confiscated and liquidated. And here we have a memo, a protocol from January 1939 of a meeting held in Ferdinand's home with Dr. Führer, the lawyer, and various representatives of museums, the tax and authorities, the Gestapo, representative of Hitler was there, to divide up his artworks. And this is the page where they list all the major artworks and talk about where they're going to be given or sold away. Everything was done in the Nazi era in this sort of quasi-legal way, where they would impose a judgment, they would get an order to liquidate the estate, and then they would sort of sell it off to pay off the taxes that had been levied and satisfy the judgment. So in this, you can see the Klimt paintings are listed first on the left, and there were, as I mentioned, representatives of all the different museums, also representative of Hitler, who you may know tried to study art as a young man in Vienna. Maria and many others have said if they had just let him into the academy and allowed him to be a painter, the world would have been a much better place. But when he became the Chancellor of Germany, he used his power as a sort of right of first refusal. He could actually purchase any Jewish artwork that was confiscated, and so he sent representatives. And his taste was not so modern. He liked the old Austrian Biedermeier paintings, so he obtained this Ferdinand Waldmüller, Count Esterhazy with the White Rabbit. If you ever saw the movie The Monuments Men with George Clooney, it talks about a U.S. military outfit that was tasked with saving all the art that the Nazis had taken. And so this painting was one of the many that was found in a salt mine in Salzburg, where all of Hitler's collection was being stored at the end of the war. Okay, so what happened to the Klimt paintings? I'll go through them. It's a little complicated, so hold on to your seats. So the Austrian Gallery, remember the museum that Ferdinand had been the head of the Friends and had already given one painting, they decided to purchase or really trade for the gold portrait. So they traded back to the lawyer, Dr. Führer, the landscape that Ferdinand had already donated. And in return, they received the Adele Bloch-Bauer portrait and the apple tree. And then they bought from the estate the second portrait of Adele. So they ended up with the two portraits and the apple tree. The birch forest was purchased by another museum in the city of Vienna, has its own museum, and it was purchased by the City Museum of Vienna. The houses in Unterach was kept by Dr. Führer, along with 11 other paintings to pay himself for a job well done. There's a whole bunch of correspondence on that. And the Schlosskammer picture, remember, had now returned back to Dr. Führer. He then sold it to a man named Gustav Uschitsky. Who was Gustav Uschitsky? He was a Nazi film director who made propaganda films. His most famous was one called Returning Home that was about the invasion of Poland. So you can just imagine. He made a lot of money during the Nazi era and used that money to buy paintings by his father, Gustav Klimt. He's one of those 18 illegitimate children of Gustav Klimt, and he bought this one from the formerly Bloch-Bauer collection and from the museum. Ridiculous, huh? Okay, so the paintings are all over the place. I don't have time really to talk about this last one, which is still in the Belvedere, wrongly, in my opinion. The family of the woman in the painting claimed it, as did the Bloch-Bauer, since it was in Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer's bedroom, at least through 1939, where it's listed on that inventory. And the Austrians decided to keep the painting rather than give it back to anybody, very wrongly in my view. So if you want to see a looted painting, you go to the Belvedere Museum and you can see this portrait of the murdered Amalia Zuckerkandel. But back to the rest of the story. So as I mentioned, Ferdinand died in 1945, and he left behind a very brief will giving his estate to his 2 nieces and 1 nephew. Maria's sister had been married to a Jewish lumber baron who owned property in Croatia, and they had tried to escape to Croatia, which they thought was going to be safe. But when the Nazi-affiliated Ustasha took over Croatia, they had to go into hiding. They and their 2 children managed to survive in Croatia, which I have to tell you is extremely rare. It's about 99% of Jews in Croatia were murdered by the Nazis, sent mostly to Auschwitz. But they managed to survive the war. Maria's brother-in-law came out of hiding with his wife and 2 children and was immediately arrested by the communists and accused of being a capitalist collaborator and executed. So you imagine being Jewish and surviving the Nazi period, and then he was executed by the communists. Maria's sister and her 2 children went then to Palestine. They were there during the War of Independence in Israel, 1948, and then they went and joined the 3 older brothers who had all escaped during the war to Canada and ended up in Vancouver, Canada. So after the war, Maria was in Los Angeles. Her brothers and sister were up in Canada, and they had to hire a lawyer. Sorry, it's not Hubertus Czernin who's showing on the screen, but he's a later hero. They hired a lawyer named Gustav Rienesch. Sorry, everybody's named Gustav in the story, but Gustav Rienesch was their lawyer, a family friend who helped try to recover their paintings after the war. And what Gustav Rienesch realized was that whatever property he recovered, the Austrians would not let out of Austria, because Austria had a patrimony law, which many countries have, that limits the export of artworks from the country. And they used this law against Jewish families, the surviving Jewish families after World War II, to prevent them from reuniting with their artworks. And so what would happen is, if you were a Jewish family and wanted to export something, you would make an application to export, and the Austrians would deny the export permits. And then if you appealed, they would say, well, if you were to donate some of your collection to our museums, then we'll allow you to export some other ones. And so this is exactly what happened, not just with the Bloch-Bauers, but the Austrian branch of the Rothschild family, and the later, and Zuckerkandel. All of these families had to go through all this same procedure. And the Austrians really enriched themselves and their own museums with this procedure. This was all uncovered by a journalist who I'm showing now, Hubertus Czernin, in 1998, when he did an investigation into why there were so many formerly Jewish-owned artworks hanging in the Austrian federal and state and city museums. And he wrote a whole series of articles undercover revealing this extortionate procedure after the war. Now, Gustav Rienesch, the lawyer for the family, in 1948, in April of 1948, he had a meeting with the authorities. Restitution, I should back up a little bit. The war ended in 1945. It wasn't until end of 1947, beginning of 1948, that Jews were allowed to apply to recover their property. So it took 3 years. There was there was a lot of devastation in Austria. It was military occupation for 10 years. And it wasn't until 1948 that you could even try to get your property back. And at that time, Dr. Reinisch was able to get the 12 paintings that the Dr. Führer, the Nazi lawyer, had taken. For example, he was able to get that painting that Hitler had taken out of Salzburg, bring it back to Austria, which was the procedure at that time. He collected some of the drawings and porcelain and things like that. He wanted to export them to his clients. But when he asked the Austrian gallery about the Klimt paintings that had been taken, the Austrian gallery said, no, these paintings belong to us under the will of Adele Bloch-Bauer. They said she gave them to the museum, and her husband was just allowed to keep them during his lifetime, but now that he's dead, they belong to the museum. We only have 3, they said, in a letter in January 1948. But if we don't get the other 3, we're going to sue the heirs of Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer to get the other ones. So they took a very aggressive position. And so Dr. Reinisch had a meeting with them and the Austrian authorities that governed export permits, and he made a deal. And we know this because the very next day he sent a letter to Maria's brother explaining what had happened. He had not seen the will of Adele Bloch-Bauer until that very day because the Austrians had taken it out of the files. And he wrote back to Maria's brother saying, well, I saw the will and it's not necessarily binding, but there is this agreement of Ferdinand to give them. And so I've decided to make a deal. I'm giving up on the Klimt paintings and allowing the museum to keep them. And in exchange, I hope to get export permits for all of these other artworks, the Biedermeier paintings and things like that. And that largely worked. He was able to export a number of artworks to his clients in Canada and the United States. They still were required to donate in quotation in marks, but they were required to donate drawings and porcelain to the various museums, and the Klimt painting stayed in Vienna, but most everything else got out. So it was a successful procedure, and it wasn't until 50 years later, in 1998, that Hubertus Czernin really uncovered what had happened. Because Maria, of course, if you had asked her during this time period, she said, oh, too bad, my aunt gave them to the museum. She had not seen the will. She had not known what actually happened in the post-war period. It was all sort of taken care of without her involvement. And after Hubertus Czernin uncovered this, the Austrians, to their credit, passed a new law in 1998 in the fall that was designed to unwind all of these transactions. They said if a Jewish family after the war had donated artworks to our museums in exchange for export permits, we're going to unwind that and give the artworks back. And that is when Maria called me, knowing that I was a lawyer and having been in close touch still with my mother even after my grandparents had died, and asked if I could help her with this. And I looked at some of the documents, and I really thought that a case could be made, but it wasn't so simple. The Austrians had a procedure that they set up where they would decide what to return without anybody else's involvement. I asked to come and meet with them, and they said, no, we don't meet with outside parties. It was just this commission that they had set up. And so, not surprisingly, they did return the porcelain and drawings, but when it came to the Klimt paintings, they said, no, these paintings remain in Austria because they were given by the will of Adele Bloch-Bauer. And at that time, this is now 1999, I had to decide with Maria what to do. And remember, it was not my idea. Her own father had said that the will wasn't binding. Dr. Reinisch had written that after making this deal in 1948. And I hired an Austrian lawyer to look at it from the Austrian, the current legal perspective. He also agreed. And I said, Maria, I think you have a case. We tried to sue in Austria, but in Austria, you have, unlike in the United States, in order to file a lawsuit, you have to deposit with the court a security for paying the other side's attorney's fees, which is sort of automatic in every case. That's not true in the United States, so it's much more plaintiff-friendly here, but in Austria, it's not. And so they would have required, because the amount you have to deposit is related to the amount in dispute in the litigation, it would have been several $1 million that Maria would have had to deposit with the court just to file a lawsuit. We petitioned the court to reduce that, and that petition was granted only insofar as it said Maria had to deposit everything she owned, not her house, but all of her life savings. She was 84 years old, and so not a penny left over. And so that was, of course, impossible for Maria, living by herself at 84 years old, to deposit all of her life savings with the Austrian court on the hope to get the paintings back. And so then I looked very naively at the time. I was much younger. I had hair and all of that. And I said, well, maybe you can sue in Los Angeles, right, in California. After all, you were living here when that deal was made in 1948. You were already a U.S. citizen at the time. And so I looked at the law, and there is a law that regulates when you can sue a foreign state. Remember, the paintings were owned by this museum, which was a part of the federal government of Austria. It was a federal museum. And in the United States, there was a law passed in 1976 that governs when you can sue a foreign country, and it's called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act of 1976. And not surprisingly, given the title, the general rule is that foreign states are immune, that you cannot sue a foreign country. But there are some exceptions, and one of the exceptions that had not been used very much is called the expropriation clause, and it says that when property is owned or operated by an agency or instrumentality of a foreign state, and that agency or instrumentality is engaged in commercial activities in the United States, and the property itself was expropriated in violation of international law, then you can sue. So I thought, well, the paintings were taken by the Nazis. That should be in violation of international law. The paintings are owned or operated by this museum, which is an agency or instrumentality of the state of Austria. All I have to do is find some commercial activity that the museum is engaged in the United States. And I found there was a book they published, a guidebook with actually the gold portrait on the cover. The portrait of Adele was on the cover of their book, but they published it with Yale University Press in the United States. They, of course, accepted U.S. credit cards. They advertised for tourists in the United States. So I thought there was enough of a nexus that we could do it. The big firm I was working at the time was not interested in pursuing the case, and ultimately I left the firm and I opened my own office as a solo lawyer. And one of the first things I did was I filed a lawsuit for Maria Altmann against the Republic of Austria, which basically everybody thought was insane, and it was a little bit crazy. And at the time, I wrote to Maria, I have an email I wrote her saying, this is a way for us to keep the case alive, because remember, it's a political thing when you're dealing with a foreign country, and if the government changed in Austria, I thought maybe we could revisit this issue with the new government. So we filed a lawsuit. Austria then replied to it by seeking to dismiss the case on a number of different grounds, including the argument that this Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act of 1976 could not be applied retroactively to a case that concerned events that took place in the 30s and 40s. And that issue went all the way up to the Supreme Court. We won, actually, in the District Court and the Court of Appeal, much to everybody's surprise. After we won in the Court of Appeal, the U.S. government intervened on Austria's behalf because they were getting lots of calls and letters from countries all over the world worried that they were going to be sued in U.S. courts. And so that case then went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which is very rare. They only take about 70 or 80 cases in the current last few decades every year. And most of them involve other not civil cases brought by individual plaintiffs, but other types of cases. And so it's a very rare thing. And of course, I had never argued in the U.S. Supreme Court, but I went with Maria in a very cold February 2004 to Washington, and here you can see us there. And I was really prepared to lose. I had a sort of gallows humor going into the argument. No one thought we could win, and I was just hopeful we could get at least one justice, one of the 9 on our side. But by the time I got up to speak, the Austrian government's lawyer and the U.S. government's lawyer had spoken before us, and they were being hit with questions. And so I got up to speak, and at the U.S. Supreme Court, I'm not sure how it is in India. You can ask your friend, the former Chief Justice. But in the United States, when you present in the U.S. Supreme Court, they pepper you with questions because they sort of talk to each other through their questions to you. So you don't really get to give a speech. You just sort of start, and they take over. And so I started off by saying there were 4 grounds for affirming. This is all tape recorded, so I can't lie about any of it. You can check it. And I said there are 4 grounds for affirming. Ground 1 is, and I immediately got interrupted by Justice Souter, who was a very, very smart judge on the court at that time. And he asked me this long, convoluted question. And at the end of it, I had no idea what he was talking about, just not a clue. And this was, remember, my very first minute at the Supreme Court. And so he ended his question, and I didn't know what to say. And you could hear sort of a blank pause on the tape if you want to listen to it. And I said the only thing I could think of was, "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I don't think I understood the question." And there were these gasps from the audience, you know, like I was a skater who fell at the Olympics on the first jump, right? It was really just horrible. But he was very magnanimous, and all the other justices smiled as if to say, "Thank goodness you asked. We didn't understand it either," right? He always does this, right? It was that type of breaking the ice moment. And of course, it also established my credibility because the question itself was really incomprehensible the way he had asked it. And so he rephrased it. I sort of understood what he was saying, and I went on, and the rest of the argument went like a dream, because I had shown that I wasn't going to make things up. I mean, who was I? I was just a kid from Los Angeles representing my grandmother's best friend in this completely insane case, trying to recover Nazi-looted paintings from Austria, right? So I answered things as best I could, and I sort of floated out the courtroom. My dad, a retired judge, said to me, "For the first time, you might even have a chance." And I was just so happy. And I returned to Los Angeles, and I opened up the legal newspaper in California. I was writing about it, and it said, "Court likely to reverse Altman case." It was all that we were going to lose, a whole page of how we were going to lose. And so I called up the journalist, and I said, at least you could have said Randy did a good job, but court likely to reverse. Like I was so disappointed because it really had gone very well, I thought. But my brain was telling me, yes, we're probably still going to lose. And I told the reporter, I said, "Well, you're going to be there when they announce the decisions. They don't give any warning. Here's my home phone number. Call me when it's announced." So sure enough, 3 months later, making breakfast in Los Angeles and for the kids, and the phone rings, and it's this journalist. And I said, "Okay, get the bad news." And he said, "No, not bad news. You won. 6-3 decision, Justice Stevens." I probably dropped the phone because I don't remember anymore. I raced then over to Maria's, and we embraced and celebrated, and the family came over, and everybody was so happy. And then we realized, what did we win? We had won just the right to start the case. And it was already 6 years into this ordeal that we had not won the paintings. And so we went back to sort of square one. And it wasn't until the following year when we had a mediation. And up to this point, the Austrians had refused to speak with us at all about resolving the case. And so I figured it was just a formality. But at the mediation, they offered to do an arbitration in Austria to take the case out of the U.S. court system. And that's something actually I had written and recommended in 1999 when they first decided not to give the paintings back, because I realized there's this issue of law that their art restitution board was not qualified to decide, and it really should have gone to an arbitration panel. And so I was very excited about this offer, and I went to Maria into another room, and I said, "Oh, isn't this terrific?" And she said, "Are you crazy? Why would I want my case decided by Austrian judges? We're so successful here in the United States. Why would I take that risk?" And I said, "Maria, you're 89 years old. And if we want this case decided in your lifetime, we have to take this chance. Because even if we were lucky enough to win the case, try the case and win the case, they could still appeal again all the way to the Supreme Court. It would have taken many, many years." And so she trusted me enough to let me go back to Austria. It's not like it was in the movie. I was all alone there with just the judges and the lawyer on the other side. And so I argued this case. It was in German. I had a translator, but I can speak German pretty well, so most of it was in German. And then we waited for the decision. We waited and waited and waited, and there were rumors that we were going to lose, of course. And finally, I got an email one night, very late in Los Angeles in January, and it was from the arbitrators. And I opened up the decision, and if you know German, it's very long-winded, and they put the verb at the end, and so I had to read about an entire page until I found out we won. We won the case, and all three arbitrators decided in our favor, echoing the argument that Maria's father had made back in 1926, that the will was precatory. It was just a request that her husband give his property after he died. He did not do that because the property was taken from him before he died. and therefore it should have been returned to him, but was traded away for export permits after the war, and therefore under Austria's new law, the paintings had to be returned. So then we did celebrate, and I have to say the best moment for me, we brought the paintings to Los Angeles in April of 2006, and there I could see Maria surrounded by all her children and grandchildren, nieces and nephews, sort of the last matriarch of the family, surrounded by these paintings that she always said she had gone to visit as a child in her uncle's home after her aunt had died. He kept them as a memorial room, all in one room with flowers in the middle, and they recreated this at the museum. And that was really, for me, the most special moment of the whole thing. Later that year, the paintings were auctioned off at Sotheby's, but the gold portrait was sold to Ronald Lauder for his museum, the Neue Gallery. It's just been announced this year that museum is being donated to the Metropolitan Museum, and so it will stay in the Neue Gallery, which is about a block and a half away from New York's Metropolitan Museum, which is one of the most famous museums in the world, and will be part of that museum. So that is the gold portrait. The following year, 2 statues from Ferdinand's collection were identified based on this photograph from 1907 from the first public display of the gold portrait, and were returned, and those were donated by the family. So you see them there 100 years later at the Neue Gallery. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't go on too long. It's a little bit longer than I hoped, but I'll stick around for any questions. And thank you again, Sharon and Ganesh, for inviting me to do this talk. If I could add one more thing, in the scheme of things, art theft was a very minor crime compared to the others committed by the Nazis in World War II. Millions of people were killed. My own great-grandfather was murdered in Treblinka. And I think it's understandable that after the war, people had other issues to worry about. There were more difficult things to deal with. And so maybe artwork wasn't the first thing on everybody's mind. But it was really just such a privilege for me, coming from this type of family with the same history, so many years, so many decades later, to be able to do a little bit of justice for the Bloch-Bauer family. So thank you again for listening, and I'm here for any questions anybody might have. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Schoenberg. An amazing talk, and we've received a lot of compliments on the chat. I want to start with a question which says, I think you can turn off your
sure.
screen share, so it'll only have the 3 of us.
Okay, let me see if I can do that.
Yes.
Does that work?
So the first, it says, saw the movie, Mr. Schoenberg, and hearing you now narrating the events is extremely interesting. After this litigation, has there been any other Nazi-era looted artwork litigations that you have handled?
Yeah, so while it was going on, I handled several. Actually, if I was sharing, I could show you some. Maybe I should go back to sharing the screen because I have a few other.
Please do.
Other paintings. Let's see if I can do that to show. And not every case is like the Bloch-Bauer one, but this painting, for example, was returned to the family of Maria's brother-in-law, Bernard Altman. It's a Klimt painting. This Canaletto painting as well. He had 4 of these, and only 1 has been found so far, so there are 3 others. Very famous Venetian painter. This painting by Pablo Picasso, I handled this case. Actually, this was the first case that I came to a successful conclusion to before the Bloch-Bauer one, but it had been owned by a German family and was brought to France and looted there. So I have handled a number of other ones. Since the conclusion of the Klimt case, not so much. As mentioned in the introduction, I went on to be president of the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, so I focused a lot on that and less on doing litigation. There are still ones, of course, that didn't work out, like the Amalia Zuckerkandel painting I showed you, the one that the Austrians refused to recover. There's also, I worked on the potential recovery of this painting, which is one of the most famous paintings by one of the most famous artists, Jan Vermeer. It's the artist in his studio, a self-portrait from behind. That is the crown jewel of the Austrian Kunsthistorisches Museum, their art history museum. I represented one of the heirs seeking to recover that because that painting was actually forcibly taken by Hitler from, he paid for it. So when you say by force, but the owner of the painting was not Jewish, but had a wife with Jewish background, and he was forced to sell the painting to Hitler for less than what others had offered, and that should have been a return, but it has not been. The Austrians recovered it by confiscating all the property of Adolf Hitler. So this was owned by Adolf Hitler, and as a result is in the Austrian Museum. So there are a lot of things that are still out there. I helped out with this case, also unsuccessful, in Los Angeles. There's a museum called the Norton Simon Museum. These are two paintings by Lucas Cranach that came from the Krautsticker collection. He was an art dealer who died fleeing the Nazis. He had a boat accident crossing the English Channel. His very young widow and child survived, tried to recover them. The Dutch did like the Austrians and fought very hard with people, especially heirs, when the original owner didn't survive, to do the recovery. And they took 200 paintings from the Krautstickers. In 2006, they had returned, actually it was earlier, I think they returned 198 of those, but these two they had sold in the meantime, and they ended up in Pasadena and Los Angeles. So they're 100% looted paintings. They had been taken during the war by Hermann Goering and found in the mines in Salzburg, but never returned, and still not returned because the U.S. law, the judges, some of the same judges who handled my case, decided that it would violate the act of state doctrine to challenge what the Dutch did in selling the artworks in the 1960s, and therefore these paintings, they aren't not looted. They're definitely stolen paintings, but the U.S. court said that they couldn't adjudicate the case, basically. So anyway, that gives you an idea of some of the other cases that are out there.
So it brings me to the next question. In the movie, they mentioned the existence of a restitution committee. Is there such a committee which handles all of the other cases of restitution, or was that a very brief period?
Yes, no. So it still exists. There is a committee. I keep trying to get them to reconsider the Zuckerkandel painting, but they refuse to do that. It still exists. It was initially formed by the Austrians with sort of government officials and others who were friendly to the government's position. And I think the whole law originally was sort of a PR move. They had gotten a lot of bad press when Hubertus Chenin wrote that, and they wanted to sort of reestablish their reputation. They thought, well, then give back to the Rothschild family hundreds of smaller items, coins and armor and things. They had one nice painting that was worth a few $1 million by Franz Hals, but other than that, it was sort of negligible items, so they could make a big splash by making a return to the Rothschilds and then be done with it, and didn't realize that it would go on to include some of their most iconic artwork. So this commission does occasionally do new rulings when they find new things in Austrian museums, and it still does exist. Yes.
So the next question is, the passage of time is particularly problematic in art restitution. Should limitation principles operate normally where the original dispossession itself resulted from persecution?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The statute of limitations is a legal concept that we have to sort of give some finality and let people move on. And that is a really important question. So it happened that when we were litigating, the statute of limitations had been sort of lifted for these cases. That statute was later declared unconstitutional in California. There's now a new statute of limitations, a federal one that was passed this last year that allows these cases to proceed. So that's sort of a judgment call of the countries. The more, I wouldn't say more interesting, but more relevant maybe question is the choice of law. So in American law, you have a principle where it says the thief cannot convey good title. So you don't have any good faith purchaser defense. Once stolen, it always remains stolen. So if you steal something, the original owner can recover it. In many jurisdictions, I'm not sure what the case is in India, they have good faith purchaser defenses. When I taught in law school, I would say, especially in American law, it's very good to quote something in Latin, something from Roman law is always important. So you have bona fide, right? Good faith purchaser, that's a big deal. But there is also a Latin phrase, caveat emptor, which means let the buyer beware. And the issue is, if you're familiar with the story of King Solomon in the Bible, where the two women are fighting over a baby, they each claim to be the mother, and King Solomon says, let's cut the baby in half. And of course, the real mother says, no, let her have it. And that's how he decides who the real mother is, because she's the one that's willing to give up for the life of the baby. In reality, in the law, the judges can't cut the baby in half. They have to decide one wins and one loses. And so you have a choice between potentially two innocent parties, the good faith purchaser and the original owner, right? Neither of them did anything wrong, and one of them has to lose. And so the American rule is that the original owner gets it. Many European countries take a good faith purchaser defense or prescription, which is like a statute of limitations, and give it to the current owner. And it's just a judgment call in the jurisdiction. There's no real right or wrong. The law has to just pick one or the other. So that's really the question. And it puts the burden, if I can talk a little bit more about the law, it really is about who holds the burden, right? So if the rule is like the American one, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, it means the purchaser has to really check to make sure that he's getting good title, right? Or she is receiving the actual property itself and from someone who has a right to give it. And so, for example, in real estate transactions in the United States, you get title insurance as a result of this, because you can never be 100% sure that when you buy a home that the person selling has the right to sell it. So you get insurance just in case that turns out not to be true. So again, the burden is on the purchaser. In a regime where the good faith purchaser wins, then the burden is on the original owner to let everybody know that it's stolen, right? You have to advertise the fact so that no one buys it by mistake, right? No one can claim to be a good faith purchaser if they know the Mona Lisa is missing, which is why the Mona Lisa is famous, because it was stolen in the early 1900s and missing for several years, and there were newspaper reports everywhere, so no one could buy it in good faith, right? So those are the two issues, as who gets it and who has the burden of making sure that the defense doesn't apply. Anyway, yes. It's a good question, and it is the big question. We have like the Elgin marbles, which the Greeks are trying to recover from England, and it's been 200 years or so since those were brought to England. And is that enough to say, okay, we have to all move on or not? It's a good question.
I think you've answered the next one, but I'll put it up anyway. A very well illustrated and enlightening talk. My question is, if the subject, I'm assuming the owner, like Adele Bloch-Bauer, holds no right on the work, what happens when the artwork is gifted and not sold? Who owns the rights, the artist or the subject? So what if there is no precedent title is probably what he's asking.
Well, there's a whole bunch of different issues involved in that, because, for example, you have copyright. So it really depends, again, on the legal regime. I'm not familiar with Indian law, but if it's similar to the British and American law, the copyright usually goes to the artist. Many countries, not so much the United States, but many countries have the rights that are given to right of publicity, for example, of the person in the painting. And there are all sorts of moral rights that can attach, and these are different bundles of rights that can be broken up and gone to different places. So, for example, in at least under American law, the physical object and the copyright are separate pieces of property. So the artist can retain the copyright, the right to make reproductions, but the physical painting can be sold and resold. There are many countries that have resale royalties, so that the artist, let's say they sell something when it's not very valuable, and then their reputation grows because of the other work that they've done, and then someone sells one of their works that were bought very cheaply, and so there's a lot of laws in the world now that try to give back to the artist some of that profit that is made on their work and reputation. So there are a whole bunch of different aspects to that, and it really just depends on what legal regime you're working under, and that applies also with what I was just speaking about with the good faith purchaser defenses and and whether a thief can convey good title and all that. Most of these cases have a real problem because the paintings move from one jurisdiction to the next. And so they're, sorry for the art people here, it's a little bit technical for the law, but the issue is one of choice of law. So imagine you have a painting that that is lost in Europe, stolen in Europe, and then resold somewhere else in Europe, and then it comes to the United States, and then comes to South America, and it goes back to Europe, and then goes back to America, and then it goes to India. So let's say a court has to decide, is it stolen? Whose law applies, right? Is the law where the transaction took place? Is it the law where the original owner? Is it the law where the property ended up? These are very difficult legal questions, and there are a whole bunch of different rules on how to decide choice of law. But that sometimes is the $1 million question. So what jurisdiction gets to apply the law, or what jurisdiction's law is applied? We had a case in the United States that's going on now with a Pizarro painting, where the court applied Spanish law. Now there's a new law in the United States saying you have to go back and redo that because we don't want you to apply Spanish law in this case. You should apply California law, that type of thing. It's super complicated.
We'll move on to the next. When the US government, due to international committee, brought about an amicus curiae brief against you, did you anticipate how that would affect the case, or did it come as a surprise?
Well, I didn't think that they would get involved. I sort of lobbied them. Before they get involved, they sort of invite comment, and I said, first of all, you're wrong on the law, which turned out to be correct, right? And it's also, I thought, bad form to oppose an American citizen trying to get justice for what the Nazis did. But for whatever reason, the Solicitor General's office in the United States it's sort of a world in itself, and they don't follow instructions. I originally thought it was coming out of the State Department, because the State Department handles these relations with foreign countries. But I've recently heard that the person in the State Department didn't want them to get involved, but the Solicitor General's office decided the principle of law that they wanted to uphold was different from what we thought, and so they got involved anyway. So who knows who was making the decision there? It was obviously not something I wanted them to do. And when they did intervene, it really took the wind out of our sails, as they said. It made it very unlikely that we would win. We all thought, but somehow we prevailed. Very lucky. You can read the case. The person who asked the question obviously knows a lot, and you can look up the case and listen to the argument and judge for yourself whether we have the right argument or not.
The next one is, what are the biggest modern obstacles lawyers and historians face today when attempting to trace Nazi looted art across private collections versus state-owned institutions?
Right, so it's a very good question. So I was successful because this was a federal museum, and Austria had a new federal law that regulated what to return. As I mentioned, there are many paintings in private collections, like, for example, those missing Canaletto paintings, right? The Bernard Altman family, 1 out of 4. So where are they? And could you get them back if they were found? It really depends on where they're found and what the law is in that jurisdiction, very much. And so it's a real challenge locating artworks in private collections. And then when they're found, having the right to recover them. Even in Austria, for example, where the porcelain collection, I mentioned there were 300 settings, right? And they recovered, they were given back, was it 19 or 23? I can't remember, because one was the drawings, one was the porcelain, but they recovered, let's say, 40 of them, right? I mean, it's 260 of those are being traded around in Austria, and if they're in private hands, Austrian law does not let you recover them. Same in Germany and most of the European countries. The statute of limitations and prescription periods have expired. There wasn't any constituency lobbying for helping Jews recover property after World War II, because all the Jews were killed or left. And so, for example, the restitution laws had a shorter statute of limitation than an ordinary theft case. Why, right? Why should it be shorter? that type of thing. So yeah, no, it's very, very difficult in private hands to recover anything, unfortunately. Unless it would come to the United States, and then you could argue that the U.S. law that a thief cannot convey good title applies, and you could try in the United States. So that's the issue. That's the choice of law issue as well.
The next one is, why did you agree to a binding arbitration in Vienna when most of the legal experts thought it was a trap?
Yeah, good question. I think it was a little bit naivete, like not really understanding what the risks were. On the other hand, I was very well aware of the problems and risks we would have in continuing litigation in the United States, right? So it was not as if it was going to be an easy walk through the park. We had problems of evidence, for example. How do you prove something happened in the 1920s and 30s? There are no living witnesses, right? So you have to do everything through experts, and so that's problematic also. When you go to a trial, we still have these issues of statute of limitations. Remember, we were relying on a statute that later in the case of the Cranach paintings was declared to be unconstitutional. And so there were many risks of proceeding this way. I thought at the time that if we could go to arbitration, we could limit the issues involved in the case just to this issue of the will, where I thought we really had a good chance, given the analysis that we had of the Austrian law. And there was an Austrian professor who wrote a legal opinion for us, and he was the head of the Institute for Civil Law in Austria. And I really thought it would be very difficult for arbitrators to oppose him, especially under their legal system, where they really, in the US, it's the judges and the courts that are sort of at the top. In Austria, it's really the professors who write these compendiums of the law who are considered the leading authorities, and we had the leading authority on inheritance law on our side. So I thought I could limit the questions to something we could win. But it was a risk, and as you can see with the Zuckerkantel painting, which I always believed was the most simple case, the best case that I had of all of the ones that I handled, it was just the most obvious. It's listed on the inventory in 39. Ferdinand already left. It was never returned to the family. It's in a federal museum. What's the issue, right? What could possibly be the issue? And they came up with some story that Ferdinand had given it away, and which also didn't matter because there's plenty of law saying that even a gift during the Nazi era is not valid. So it was A, not possible, and B, irrelevant, and I still lost in front of the same arbitrators. So go figure.
Yeah. The next one, we in India have issues with the British who took away by force a lot of our art. Would judgments pronounced in courts in the US also resonate in suits that may be filed in Europe?
Yeah, so I'm not a British lawyer. I don't know exactly what the law is there, and I think it's a little bit of a hybrid between the U.S. and Europe. And I don't know of any successful litigation in England for recovery of art, actually. So it's a good question. But it would depend on whether they apply this rule, the thief cannot convey good title, and what their statute of limitations are. I presume people have looked at it, and not having heard of any success, I think there must be some impediment to bringing a case like that in England. I mean, I know the Greeks have been looking at forever the issue with the Elgin marbles, but I'm not familiar with any Indian cases so far. And it depends if you're talking about artworks that are still in England or whether they've moved on to other places. That's also an issue. So you might have more luck if they ended up in the United States. And there are cases that are frequently bought in the United States concerning art taken from or cultural property taken from other countries and smuggled into the United States. There's issue of patrimony. So many countries, I'm not sure if India is one of them, have laws saying that even archaeological things found underground belong to the state. So, for example, Mexico, Egypt, Italy, these places that have antiquities, they have rules saying that only the state can own these things. And so even if you find something in the ground, it belongs to the state, and if you try to bring that to the United States, it's considered importing stolen property. And so there are prosecutions for that frequently involving what they call pre-Columbian art, so before Columbus art in the Americas, Asian art from the Middle East, etc.
So being mindful of time, I'm going to take one last question, which shifts from law to the lawyer. The legal battle stretched for 8 long years. You have quit your job. How did you stay focused and motivated throughout the period, particularly while supporting a family that depended on you? Now, before you answer this, I had a question too. Being a person who's way ahead in the fraternities, I looked at the movie and I found Maria Altman to be a very difficult client. Was she really that difficult? And how did you manage a difficult client? Tell us. I think we all need to learn that.
Yeah, not at all difficult. And that the worst, for me, the worst scene in the movie and completely fictional is when the two characters fight and he swears at her. And I mean, of course, never would happen. No, Maria was my grandmother's best friend, and we would get together and she would tell me stories about my grandparents, about my great grandmother, and it was, it was like hanging out with a grandparent and someone you respected. So we had a very very good relationship. It wasn't difficult at all. In terms of the legal battle and it being 8 years, yes, that was not so easy. But my wife, who you saw coming in, getting her dragon out in the background, she was very supportive. We had 3 very young children during the process, actually. Well, one was born. The first one was born a few months before it started, and then we continued. And it was not all consuming in the sense that there wasn't a lot of activity all at any one time. When you're on appeal, for example, you have to do something every few months. Usually you have to write something. And so there were sort of little bursts of activity, but for the rest of the time I could concentrate on earning some money and supporting my family. Wasn't easy. When I left, I left a very big firm. I was being paid very, very well. And the first year I made almost no money. So it took a while to build things up. Ultimately, I partnered with another lawyer, and he had more business for me to work on. So I sort of did his work for him and earned money that way, and was able to support myself while I handled this crazy case that no one thought would turn into anything. Yeah, I mean, the movie, the movie's good. It obviously changes things. I never went to Vienna with Maria, for example, but of course they had to put that together in the movie to make it entertaining. And there's that one scene where I'm about to go to the Supreme Court, and my wife, played by Katie Holmes, goes into labor, and she says, "Oh, don't worry, honey, you go on and do your thing." That obviously didn't happen, but the reason that's in the movie is that my wife was pregnant when I went to Washington. She was about 30 weeks. And while I was in Washington, a day and a half before the argument, I was sitting with Maria. I got a call on my cell phone, and it was her. And she said, don't get excited, but I'm in the hospital with preterm labor. She actually went into the hospital, and they stopped it. Thank goodness. And the baby was full term. But I told the screenwriters about that because I thought, okay, they need to have these dramatic Hollywood type moments. And so even though that is fictional, it's based on something true. And most of the movie, almost all of the movie is that way. It's based on something true at its core, which makes it very nice for me. I mean, another example is my child. We have 3 kids, and they're in the movie, they're only 2. And so I told the producers, I said, who's going to pay for the therapy for the kid who's not in the movie, right? Like, how can you do this to me? And so they said, okay, we'll combine the 2 boys. We'll make the birth, which was Joey, and we'll call him Nathan, right, in the movie. So they can both pretend to be in the movie that way. So there are a lot of things like that. Another one, for example, if you've seen the movie, one of the emotional cores of the movie is Maria saying goodbye to her parents. And that did not happen that way. Her father actually died over the summer in 1938, so she never had that departure talk, which they invented for the movie. And when I watched the movie initially when it came out, I did a lot of talks, and so I watched it 10 times or whatever. And I did one of these talks, and someone said, "Oh, that was so moving," and it is the most movie, an emotional part of the movie. And she said, that my mother did the same thing. She said, like her parents, I never saw them again. And I realized my own grandfather did the same thing. My mother's father left his parents behind and never saw them again. And so even in something sort of fictional for Maria, they encapsulated the story for all of the Jews in that community, that Jewish community. So I thought that they did a good job with that. So I hope that answers.
Actually, one last question before I hand this over to Sharon. Was the escape as dramatic as it's in the movie? Because it's a very dramatic escape.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I have, I think, a blog post or two with both Fritz and his brother Bernard wrote about it. But yes, that was it was either a dentist or doctor's appointment they said that Fritz had, and so they went together and then snuck out the back and made it to a plane that was waiting for them that flew them to Germany, as I said. And if you read, there's a book called Lady in Gold by Anne Marie O'Connor that she went into the details of that and found out about that priest who successfully smuggled them across the border. And Maria always complained she got caught in the barbed wire and tore her dress and that type of thing. So yeah, no, that stuff really did happen. There's basically no one who got out alive that doesn't have a story like that. So my grandparents, the same type of thing. It's
That is horrific indeed. So on that note, thank you so much. I'm going to hand over the platform to Sharon.
Thank you. I'm so glad that our first talk in the Art and Law series was you, because you really held our attention and it was riveting. Of course, the fact that this was made into this iconic film has added to our audience's delight. And I can't thank you enough. I hope we're going to see you in India since now you can come down. You have two friends here. And we hope to see you. And thank you again. Thank you very, very much. And thank you, Ganesh, for holding it all together. And we hope to see you soon. And for those of you who want to join us on every other talk, the chat box has a number and an email that you can send us a message. So we add you to our list. So we look forward to seeing you all. And Mr. Schoenberg, you must join us on the next few talks. We'd love to have you ask us and enjoy our joy of the Art and Law series.
Great.
Thank you.
That sounds like it's going to be a good series. I hope you're going to continue to have a lot of success. And I'm happy to join if I'm awake.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for waking up for us today.
No problem. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.